big disadvantage that they were surrounded and they were hot.
Total War Warhammer 2 sure is a video game. But before we even begin talking about it, there is some esoteric nerd history you need to be aware of. The Total War series is a survivor. This story begins in the ancient times, the 90s. The world back then was just darkness and fog, and from these primordial elements, the original video games were born. The very first shooters.
These games are getting really realistic.
Ancient adventure games. And real-time strategy games.
You must construct additional pylons.
This might seem a little odd, but real-time strategy was a huge fad back in the 90s. A typical PC gaming magazine of the period might dedicate up to 1/5 of its pages to the coverage of RTSs. The ancient people sure loved their real-time strategery. The old ways were so absurd. But there was a problem. As years went by, real-time strategy games were steadily losing ground to other genres, slowly going out of favor with both the critics and the gamer masses. One of the issues was right there in the name. It would be more honest to refer to these as real-time action games with strategy elements. The consumers resented this. The genre went into decline. Exiled from human society, RTS gamers retreated underground, away from civilization, never to be seen again. Some say their ancestors still live there, in the deep caverns, biding their time, waiting for their masters to return to the overworld. Over the years, many philosopher nerds made attempts to revitalize the genre. Say, what if we make an RTS game, but it's in space and has a full 3D movement?
Roger that.
Cool idea, instant cult classic. Not enough to save the genre. What if we made an RTS game, but with a focus on army control, abandoning the base building aspect altogether?
But today, we'll show them that the Red Army bows to no one!
This is Sokol 1. Red Dome. I say again, Red Dome. We have 3 main objectives. Destroying the US 6th Armored Battalion, securing the Moltke Bridge over the Spree, and clearing the 17th June Street for use by Army Command.
Today, we'll show them the might of the Soviet Union!
Interesting experiment, cult classic. Not enough to save the genre. But what if? What if we double down on our game being base-free, but now it has unit inventories and realistic physics, sophisticated damage modeling for vehicles, environmental destructibility, and an optional manual control mode, a new novel way of controlling your units? The Men of War series had a lot of potential, completely squandered by incompetent publisher. Real-time strategy was deader than disco. A user-made map for Warcraft 3 exploded in popularity, creating MOBAs. Everyone knows this story. MOBAs are sometimes seen as inheritors of RTSs since they have many similar mechanics. And these are great games, popular games. But it's just not the same, it's a very different kind of experience. What does this all mean for millennials who grew up playing Warcraft 2 and Command & Conquer? Deprived of our sacred traditions, are we doomed to remain in the deep caverns forever? Not all attempts to revitalize the genre were failures. 20 years ago, Creative Assembly, a game development company from the UK, released Shogun Total War.
The year is 1530. For 200 years, the Ashikaga shogunate has ruled Japan from their capital in Kyoto.
The gameplay was divided in two layers, a strategy layer, which played like a 4X nation management game, and a tactical layer, where you played RTS battles, initiated from the strategic layer. The subsequent Total War games would share the same basic structure, including the popular Rome Total War, released just 4 years after Shogun. I've always had a quiet resentment for the Total War series. You know, the kind of mean, dumb resentment that nerds sometimes develop towards media products. This is shit. It's just like other games I like, but not quite. I thought the strategic gameplay wasn't as deep compared to Civilization or Galciv or whatever the 4X was popular at the time, and the RTS gameplay wasn't as varied and satisfying as in Yuri's Revenge. Take Shogun 2, for example. Over the years, I put a lot of hours into this game, but a significant percentage of that time was spent playing with only a small handful of unit types. Spear and bow armed peasants that are a core of medieval Japanese army. Spears and bows. Probably a realistic portrayal of medieval Japanese warfare, but it's just so goddamn boring and one-dimensional. Rome 2 Total War was a scandalous release. Everyone was making fun of the bugs. But I didn't care. I spent my childhood playing Troika games, and these were goddamn catastrophes from a technical perspective. I can tolerate bugs and jank if the game has a soul. But what killed Rome 2 for me was the mechanical simplicity of its strategic layer, its political and economic systems. See, Rome 2 was released in 2013, but only a year prior, Paradox Interactive published Crusader Kings 2, which ended up being their first grand strategy title that managed to reach mainstream audiences. Crusader Kings was innovative, deep, and accessible, and it completely killed Total War for me. Every time I looked at the strategic interface in one of those games, all I could see was like a children's cartoon version of a real thing. Total War fans would be deeply insulted by this. You idiot, you fool, you just don't get Total War. And that's true, I didn't. Not until I played Total War Warhammer 2.
Let us begin.
Do you think 40k can fit in the Total War framework? This is a subject of many heated debates in the community. So far, there is no consensus. But as it turns out, Warhammer Fantasy is a perfect fit. The older Total War titles were historical games. Back in 2004, the History Channel aired an animated series which used Rome Total War engine to depict famous historical battles.
Driven on by hunger and anger, they smashed through the Roman line.
The franchise never attempted to be a 100% accurate simulation, but in a historical setting, factions and units need to be at least somewhat grounded in reality. But fantasy is free of these limitations. In fantasy, anything goes. You can make all kinds of absurd armies. Take the Empire, for example, one of the more powerful human states. You start with basic swordsmen and spearmen backed by crossbows and artillery. Fairly conventional. At this point, you can't even tell you are playing a fantasy game. Armies in Rome 2 or Medieval 2 weren't very different from this. But the more you play, the more things begin to change. Karl Franz, the faction leader, can fly around the battlefield on his pet griffon called Deathclaw. You can build magic colleges. These allow for the recruitment of various kinds of wizards. Some can summon monsters, others heal your troops, and yet others have powerful direct damage abilities, like the Lore of Fire. A well-aimed spell can net you hundreds of kills. The Imperial Cavalry consists of conventional horse-mounted knights, but there are also these guys who ride monsters called demigryphs. They hit like a truck. The army is supported by skirmishers, rifle-armed dragoons. In the mid-game, you can get dragoons with grenade launchers, and things just keep escalating. There are steam tanks, Katyusha rockets, and magical laser artillery. The unit diversity is phenomenal. You have so many toys to play with. It's honestly such a breath of fresh air. If you own the DLC, there is a nice roster of religious units and heroes as well. Unbreakable fanatics, immune to fear and morale damage. They'll make short work of anyone falling to chaos. But we are not fallen. We are ascended, says Archeon the Ever-Chosen. So a buddy of mine drafted me into playing a co-op campaign, and after a short deliberation, we decided to play as the Empire's main nemesis.
I urge my master that now is the time to march south. The Northmen grow restless. We must harness that and send the tribes in a great tide southwards.
There is a lot of drama surrounding the Warriors of Chaos, both in the lore and in Total Warhammer community. These guys are a fantasy equivalent of Chaos Space Marines, except they are badass mutated Viking warriors. Their ultimate goal is to burn the world. Chaos Warriors are a DLC faction, a pre-order DLC for Warhammer 1. The reason we are talking about it here is because Warhammer 2 has a special game mode called Mortal Empires. It combines content from both Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 into one gigantic super game. Every legendary lord, every faction from the first Warhammer is playable in the second, if you own both titles, that is. Mortal Empires is amazing, and it's very much the default way of playing the game. This appears to be the community consensus. Almost all multiplayer campaigns you see hosted in the lobby are hosted on the Mortal Empires map. The goal of the Chaos faction is to burn the world, but these guys are not quite as potent or scary enough to be a proper threat for the forces of order, so we need to fix that. SFO Grimhammer 2 is a popular mod for the game that makes all kinds of balancing changes. This is how the Chaos Warriors tech tree looks in vanilla, and this is how it looks in SFO. Interesting that in the lore, Archeon succeeds in ending the world, essentially destroying the fantasy Warhammer setting and paving the way for a reboot. I think the miniatures weren't selling. But we won't be playing as Archeon. We'll be playing as Sigvald the Magnificent. Very much a contrarian choice, he is the least popular of all Chaos champions. Sigvald is a scion of the Chaos deity Slanesh, the dark god of iPhones, porn, processed food, and pop music. Slanesh is the god of pleasure, of experiencing everything to the fullest, a god with a strong connection to arts and creative acts, a god of writers, actors, and Pretty Boy Sigvald is one of his greatest champions, marching through the world of men, eradicating anything too ugly or crude.
Onward to destruction.
Speaking of, our first challenge will be the Norskans. The northern tribes of men respect strength above all, so we defeat them and draft them into our service. The horde grows. In order to invade the Empire, we need to go through Kislev, a fantasy amalgamation of various feudal Slavic states. Kislev is Kiev with 2 extra letters, but it's governed by tsars like Russia, who practice powerful winter magic. But then they also have Polish winged hussars as their elite cavalry. It's a mix of a bunch of Eastern and Central European cultures. Warhammer, the fictional universe, was created back in the 80s, in the land of Europa. And Europans fancy themselves more cosmopolitan and sophisticated compared to Americans. But despite the close geographical proximity, they never bothered to learn much about the Slavs. I'm not exactly an expert, but I'm pretty sure Kislev doesn't even have a real army in the tabletop. Although in the lore they do have all sorts of unique units and gimmicks, none of them are represented in-game. In Total War, Kislev military is basically a copy of an imperial army, but not quite as varied. They don't stand a chance against Sigvald's horde. Since you can't have 2 people playing as Chaos Warriors in co-op, my buddy had to pick something else Chaos-aligned. He will be playing the Beastmen, a breed of Chaos mutants that combine human and bestial features. Another DLC faction, these guys are kind of a laughingstock of the Total Warhammer community, and possibly the weakest army in the game, even with the mod. My friend was really passionate about Beastmen for some reason, and when I asked him why, he said, well, it's because they're outcasts, underdogs. Nobody really likes them. It's fun to root for the underdog. But then I was reading the lore, and apparently the underdogs in this particular case are cannibal rapists. In-game, their gimmick is that the units are cheap and bad at most things they do, but there sure is a lot of them, a true horde. There are several beast leaders to choose from, but we'll be playing as Malagor the Dark Omen, a powerful shaman and sorcerer with a pair of raven wings. He kind of looks like Illidan from Warcraft, except badass. Coincidentally, my first ever experience with Warhammer Fantasy was via an old strategy game which was also called Dark Omen. It was quite good and popular with nerds back in the late 90s. I wonder if it still holds up.
I am Tsarina Katarina, ruler of Kislev.
Malagor starts on the opposite end of the world map, and it will be a while till our forces can properly support one another. Meanwhile, in the north, after ravaging through Kislev, we battle the Norscan tribes again. Norscan warriors are some of the most fiercely devout followers of Khorne, the Chaos God of War. According to the wiki, the word Khorne in ancient Cypriot Greek literally means to shit blood. Fascinating lore, and a factually correct description of what we ended up doing in this battle. Sigvald got owned by a mammoth. Tier for tier, the Norscan mammoths are some of the strongest units in the game. Our army routes. We got humiliated on the battlefield. I decided to accept this loss and not to reload. I considered heading south, deeper into civilized lands, but I think what we should do instead is take a detour deeper into Norska to pacify the tribes. While we were busy getting owned by potential allies near the northern gates of the Empire, the Beastmen hordes were about to enter the human realm from the south, and in order to do that they need to get past the Border Princes, a collection of politically neutral towns and communities on the southern border of Karl Franz's empire. A haven for bandits, mercenaries, adventurers, and all manner of exiles. It makes sense that these border territories will become a home for our bestial hordes as well. At least for a short while. The city of Eikendorf will be besieged, taken, and ransacked.
We battle night and day to protect the passes into the Empire, but the enemy is too numerous.
Despite being on the same ideological side, Beastmen and the Chaos Warriors are complete opposites of one another when it comes to the art of war. Our dudes are tough, well-armored, but slow. Beastmen are individually unimpressive but mobile, favoring ambushes and skirmish tactics. The two factions actually synergize fairly well on the battlefield. First, you send forward waves of Beastmen to kite the opponent to make their ranged units waste ammo on low-value targets, and then you hit them with an impenetrable moving wall of Chaos Warriors. We won this battle with relatively low casualties. This came as a surprise for both of us, as we have a realistic assessment of the Beast People combat prowess. Okay. Back in the north, we meet Wulfric the Wanderer, the Eternal Challenger, one of the heroes added in Norska DLC for Warhammer 1. He was a talented Norscan warrior who absolutely loved talking shit. So the Chaos deities put a curse on him. They drafted Wulfric for a divine mission. He will travel the world, hunting monsters and powerful champions, collecting their skulls. And if he fails, his soul would be torn apart by demons. And this is pretty much what you do if you play as him. You travel the world and hunt rare creatures. Wulfric is one of the two new heroes added in the DLC. The other one is Throg the Troll King. In the lore, Throg plays an important role in Sigvald's story and his ultimate fate, which is understandable. They're such a great match. An ugly giant monster armed with a club, and a rapier-carrying pretty boy. And this is how the legend falls. Sorry, Wulfric, but you were just too goddamn ugly. This entire episode got me thinking, is there a rational reason to worship the Chaos Gods? In Warhammer stories, mortals are usually tricked into aligning themselves with Chaos. They do this out of ignorance and stupidity. But what if Archaon is right? What if they really are ascended? The gods of the Immaterium can make you physically stronger. Chaos can change you in all kinds of ways, both physical and mental. It can grant you knowledge. Forbidden knowledge, if you want to be all melodramatic about it. So there are good aspects to Chaos. After all, Slaanesh is a patron of the arts, as well as excess. Perhaps if we devise systems of worship that focus on these aspects, then chaos would become a positive, a vitalist force. And did you know that there are chaos gods of order and law? Karl Franz certainly doesn't want you to know. What else is he hiding from you? Chaos is the intrinsic part of the metaphysical structure of the universe. You can't get rid of it, can't destroy it. We simply need to learn to live with chaos. This is why they call it the Lone War. If you think of chaos as a military threat, then you have already been defeated. In such a confrontation, chaos will always win, eventually. Look, I'm not saying I have all the answers, that's what charlatans do. But we will never achieve victory in the Lone War without asking these complicated questions. So, are they all beast men, or are there beast women? It's a mystery. Interesting that the Beast People Society is what they call reverse racist. Yes, the fewer bestial features you possess, the lower will be your status in the Horde hierarchy. Our army strikes the Empire from the north, pillaging the coastal settlements. The target is the town of Middenheim. In vanilla Warhammer, Chaos cannot capture cities at all, only destroy them. The SFO mod changes the select few cities to be conquerable. Middenheim happens to be one of these. It will be turned into a Chaos fortress and will serve as our base of operations for the foreseeable future. Look at that, the Wood Elves took notice of us. Most of the time, the Wood Elves will be content with living inside their forest reservations. If you leave them alone, they leave you alone. But this time, things are different. In Warhammer Fantasy, Chaos has this radioactive quality to it, meaning that just by the fact of our existence, we are corrupting our neighbors, provoking unrest, and slowly, turn by turn, transforming their land into an inhospitable wasteland. So the Wood Elves will try to kill us before that happens. There are a number of ways to play Wood Elves. The most straightforward tactic would be to take advantage of the fact that they are fantastic mobile skirmishers. But archers are not the only way to play. Wood Elves have tree spirits, sort of their equivalent of monster creatures. I suppose one way to describe them is like beastmen but competent. In the lore, the Wood Elves and beastmen are mortal enemies. And so the Elven army is destroyed. The weakness of our Chaos formation is the lack of mobility. In order to remedy this, I enhanced our stack with Norscan skirmishers. Getting long-range artillery would be another good solution. Sigvald starts with one such unit, and if you were paying attention, you might have noticed that it served us really well in the campaign. What the fuck is a Hell Cannon exactly? Look at it. Some sort of a strange mix of machinery, sorcery, and flesh. The little dudes operating it are the Chaos Dwarfs, the Dawi-Jar like they call themselves, a rare sight. When the dwarf gods abandoned them, the Dawi-Jar made a deal with Hashut, a bull-like chaos demon who taught them secrets of demon-smithing. Chaos Dwarves are interesting because they live in the Darklands, the vast inhospitable expanse east of Kislev, where Warhammer 3 will supposedly take place. Hashut is not a real god, but rather a greater chaos demon who was in the right place at the right time. By helping Dawi-Jar, by saving their race, he increased his own power and influence. Hashut demands blood sacrifices, so he is still pretty evil, but it's worth noting that he generally isn't quite as much of a dick to his followers compared to other chaos gods and greater demons. The worst thing he does to Dawi-Jar are the mutations. Some of them grow horns and tusks, the bow-like features. But are these really that bad? I'm just saying there are way worse chaos entities out there, like the horned rat, the Skaven god.
The fabric of reality was torn, and from the realm of ruin, the Skaven's horned god visited its creatures. Clever child, it whispered with the voice of 1,000 screeching rats.
Skaven are a race of oversized, technologically advanced vermin. Individually weak, stupid, and evil, they are despised by other races, as well as other Skaven. Unfortunately, they are also fast breeders and are possibly the most numerous race in the world. Skaven are represented by several clans, each with its own specialization and gimmick. Like Clan Pestilence. In the lore, in order to destroy the Empire before the human state becomes powerful enough to actually threaten the Skaven, Clan Pestilence engineers the Black Plague. But, like most plans the rat fucks come up with, this one backfired. The plague killed a fuckton of Skaven, and the Empire ended up in a stronger position in the end. Clan Molder, a recent DLC clan, is known for using warpstone-based magic in order to create mutant abominations. These guys live in a place called Hell Pit, not far from Kislev. Have you noticed how the worst things in the Warhammer world are all located next to Kislev? The most well-known creations of Clan Molder are probably rat ogres. Swole rats on roids. And there is this bizarre creature called Gorich, Castellan of Hellpit. The rats experimented with transplanting human brains into rat bodies, and Gorich was the first success. Originally a Norscan Chaos champion of Khorne, he managed to piss off Archaon the Ever-Chosen. As punishment, Archaon threw Gorich into the Hellpit. The rats transplanted his brain into a body of an experimental rat ogre with bionic limbs. He's like a rat Adam Jensen, but on Tren. Gorich didn't like being a rat, at least not at first. He went on a rampage, killing many Skaven. But then the leaders of Clan Molder took notice of him and they offered Gorich a job. He had nothing else to do, really. Seems unlikely Archaon would want him back. So he became the leader of Clan Molder military.
Blood for the Blood God! Skulls for the Skull Throne!
Clan Scryer are engineers. They have flamethrowers, miniguns, energy weapons, strange machines, and even nukes. I guess if the Imperial technology can be described as steampunk, that makes Skaven warp punk, warpstone punk, rat punk. Scryer is a DLC clan, and I don't own that one because I don't play rats. I really want to like Skaven. The technology they use looks fun and it sets them apart from other factions. But there is something about their fantasy I find repulsive. I think it's all the nihilism. It doesn't seem like Skaven even have a real culture. They just eat and kill. They don't even like other Skaven. The only reason they haven't overrun the world is because they keep killing each other. Not even their god likes them. Total War Warhammer is a strategy game, but it's also a role-playing game, and I just can't get into Skaven. Look at this. The Troll King came to visit us in Middenheim. Like I mentioned, in the lore his story is connected to Sigvald's. They were supposed to work together on Archaon's orders, but Sigvald thought the King of Trolls was just too ugly, and he attempted to kill the creature. Me and my co-op partner mismanaged our diplomacy and Beastmen ended up at war with Throg, while the Chaos Warriors were not. The Beast people had no backup on the battlefield and got humiliated, but that's not really that big of a deal, it happens to them all the time. The Empire is in a bad place strategically. We managed to successfully install ourselves in the Imperial Heartland, while the Norscans burn and pillage Kislev, and the Vampire Counts attack the eastern regions. This is a fantasy game, so naturally there is an undead faction. There are several of them, in fact. Sylvania, get it? It's like Transylvania, but without the first syllable. Back in the days of Warhammer 1, the Vampire Counts were possibly the most original and innovative Total War faction ever designed. Overwhelming the enemy with absurdly sized stacks of skeletons and zombies was cool and new, but what's even better was seeing all the giant monster creatures the vampires can field. Back then, a monster-based unit roster seemed like a novel concept. Until now, Total War games were historical, and in real life, very few armies used giant monsters. There were elephants, and that's about it. But then came the sequel and a dozen expansion-sized DLCs. These days, almost all factions have a selection of monstrous units available to them, and some of the appeal of playing Vampire Counts is just no longer there. It's the opposite, actually. It would be cool if the vampires were more human. Awakening one of the ancient bloodlines grants you access to converted human units, but these are so few in number you can't make a real army out of them. At least I don't think you can. I'm not really an expert on vampire mechanics. Having a formation of Napoleonic line infantry supported by hordes of skeletons in the front and spellcasters in the back is a fun idea. I would love to play this. It's time for the final challenge of the campaign, taking on the remains of the Imperial Army.
Handsome and lethal. For the Chaos Gods!
After the destruction of Imperial armies with the combined force of Sigvald's Chaos Warriors and Malagor's Beastmen in a dramatic battle, our campaign was concluded. We had our ups and downs, but overall it was much easier than we expected. The SFO mod makes Chaos Warriors very potent. So what should our next adventure be? The dinosaur-infested Lustria is the hardest continent to explore. The settlements are spaced very far from one another. Jungle terrain imposes hard penalties on movement. Shallow water makes sea navigation difficult and in many cases impractical. The place is settled by sentient lizards, undead pirates, dark elves, Skaven, human imperialists, and Norskans for some reason. The worst possible people. I would rather be in Chaos Wastes rather than here. So Lustria is perfect for co-op campaigns.
Elites, gather!
The Hans Marshal, Marcus Wolfhard, leads an imperial expedition into Lustria. Hans Marshal's gimmick is that he semi-regularly gets supplies from the old world. By supplies I mean units. Good units. You can get Demigryph Knights and Hellstorm batteries pretty early as Hans Marshal. Fighting dinosaurs with steam tanks and Katyushas. Fuck yes. The Hans Marshal's other mechanic is that he gets a posse of unique heroes with their own backstories and side quests. They originate from various old world cultures. A witch hunter with a PhD, a Bretonnian knight without his horse, a dwarven engineer and inventor, a wood elf marksman, markswoman. Actually, is it just me or does she sort of look like a human woman in a wood elf costume? That's a little creepy. But then again, these people are imperialist psychopaths and colonizers who are fighting the natives of Lustria, the chaos-hating sentient lizards, so pathological behavior is to be expected. The SFO mod wasn't updated due to a new DLC release, so me and my buddy decided to start a game in Lustria. I was playing the Hans Marshal and he took the role of a dark elf pirate, Lokir Felhart of the Blessed Dread. Dark elves, or Druki, are some of the least cool people I've ever seen.
Druki, a joke amongst elves.
Except for the Witch King. Malekith is cool. He looks like a Morrowind character. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the Dark Elves mechanically. The units are strong and reasonably diverse. Druki have a unique ability to create black arcs. Massive floating cities that can construct buildings, support friendly land units with long-range artillery strikes, and even invade coastal settlements by themselves. Lokir starts with a black arc for free. We figured this unlikely alliance between humans and dark elves works thematically, because both of them are honestly kind of bad people. Marcus just has a better PR department. The campaign was hard. Both of us lost important fights very early but decided to stick with it, to accept our mistakes. We didn't reload and the experience was better for it. Co-op games naturally tend to be easier than single-player, so you need to challenge yourselves, to pick faction combinations that don't necessarily have amazing synergies with one another. And we fought so many goddamn dinosaurs. Lizard men are isolationist remains of an ancient anti-chaos empire. Their military is comprised of lizards of various shapes and sizes. There are little tiny pathetic lizards, and then there are some of the biggest units in the game, and they can field full stacks of those. You will be fighting full stacks of those at some point during the campaign if you are at war with the dinos. There are quite a few Dino legendary lords, both free and paid. I don't think there is anything intrinsically wrong with them, but I'm just not a huge fan of the aesthetic. It's a personal preference kind of thing. The original Warhammer races were created by psychic frogmen from outer space called the Old Ones. They made elves and dwarves, but prior to that they made the lizards to serve as their foot soldiers. And then finally they created halflings and ogres, the two races that are not present in the Total War games yet. The old Dark Omen game had a unit of mercenary ogres fighting for the Empire, and they were crazy strong.
Now you've got an ogre at your side, your enemies will get a real thumping. You just see if they don't.
Yes, we'll see.
The Old Ones also accidentally contaminated the world with orc spores. Let's talk about Warhammer orcs. Orcs are a race of barely intelligent mushrooms. Their culture combines the qualities of Eastern Slavic alcoholics and English football hooligans, complete with a Cockney accent. Last time these two got together, the map of Europa was redrawn. Orcs are dedicated to war and are basically impossible to exterminate.
Even I fear orc ferocity.
You might be wondering, what are the differences between the 40k and the fantasy orcs? Well, the answer is that in 40k, orc is spelled with a K, and in fantasy, it's spelled with a C. There are no female orcs, although the race does have a tendency to randomly mutate, so in the older fluff they supposedly could over time develop sexual characteristics. Fantasy orcs are somewhat more diverse and multicultural compared to their 40k counterparts. Goblins are just as important as their bigger and beefier cousins. Goblins are scouts, shamans, assassins. They man the war machines and domesticate grotesque monster creatures like these giant spiders. Warlord Skarsnik is a huge fan of cave squigs, bipedal asses with teeth. Skarsnik of the Crooked Moon tribe is a DLC character. His campaign has a reputation for being very challenging. Early game goblins have micro-intensive, mobile but weak units that cannot take a hit. They are quite fun to play in co-op actually, where your buddy can assist you in microing squig charges and managing goblin spider cavalry. These are very unimpressive small spiders, but it does get better eventually.
I was one, but now we are many.
The Vampire Coast is a naval-themed faction in a game with no naval battles. And they're all undead. Well, almost all of them. Aranessa Soulspite from the pirate island of Sartosa can recruit human pirates of both melee and ranged variety. Arch-Commodore Luther Harkon is a non-neurotypical option. Possessing a fractured mind, he will randomly switch from one personality to another, which changes his stats and abilities. He lives in Lustria because of course he does. Count Noctilus is actually a von Karstein necromancer stuck far away from home. He specializes in possibly the most fun unit in the entire Total War franchise, Necrophax Colossus. It's a part undead, part vehicle, part artillery piece that can get healed in battle by vampiric magic. Noctilus eventually gets a Necrophax Colossus mount, meaning you can potentially go full mech warrior with this guy, with a stack of nothing but Necrophax. Celostra Direfin is a ghost of a dead opera singer. She was sent from Britannia to the Elven continent to sing for the Phoenix King. The ship was hit by a fierce storm. Many years later it was seen again navigating the seas, crewed by the drowned dead. Celostra is accompanied by a ghost of a Bretonnian paladin hero, who I think is unique. Being a ghost, he is completely immune to normal weapons, and the Bretonnian paladins are already very hard to kill, even when they're not ghosts.
Their knights are truly pathetic.
Britannia is an elitist cavalry-based faction. While the Empire is modeled after the predominantly German Holy Roman Empire, these guys are inspired by medieval France, and there is a little bit of England in there as well. The high-tier knights are the fantasy equivalent of 40k Space Marines. Tough, deadly, and rare. They're supported by mass armies of peasants. I wanna say that the 40k equivalent of them would be the Imperial Guard, but that's not exactly true. Bretonnian peasants are much more incompetent. The entire faction, including all the units and heroes, was a free expansion-sized DLC for Warhammer 1, a very impressive chunk of content. In the second game, these guys get an additional legendary lord, or rather a lady.
Demoiselle de Guerre!
Repanse de Lyonesse is the Bretonnian not Joan of Arc. I would argue Repanse is one of the best characters to learn the game with. For one, she provides various bonuses to the peasant part of the Bretonnian army, increasing the viability of these units. For two, Repanse starts the game with a paladin hero. As I already mentioned, these guys are great at soaking damage. And finally, Repanse begins her campaign in Warhammer Not Africa, fighting undead, orcs and rats. It's simply a more fun starting location than boring-ass Bretonnia. Her main adversaries, the Tomb Kings, are another DLC race.
The desert skeletons are superior.
I'm not an expert on this particular faction. The way the AI uses them, it's almost like an undead mirror image of the tactics used by Repanse. Compared to the evil, scheming Sylvanians, the Tomb Kings are, well, to use the nerd nomenclature, they are lawful neutral. The Tomb Kings are essentially fantasy Necrons. Yeah, they have flying pyramids. What of it? The ancient Egyptians had them too. Finally, these games are getting historically accurate.
Have you heard of the High Elves?
The High Elves are an archetypical ancient dying fantasy race. The demographic situation is bad. Every citizen is a soldier. The future is bleak. The Elf country is a dying superpower, but it's still super as fuck. Their military is one of the best, and the High Elves are the only Warhammer army with Marines. My personal problem with the High Elves is that their cities look like toys. You know how some Vegas casinos have this tacky on purpose kind of look? And some of them are stylized to resemble medieval castles? The High Elf settlements give me the same vibe. It's hard to take their culture seriously once you learn that they live inside of oversized toys. But there is one High Elf who is cool.
Dragonfire runs through my veins.
Prince Imrik, the Dragon Tamer, starts the campaign in Warhammer Afghanistan, a remote region added in a patch. Imrik is a free DLC character, and his adventure is some of the most fun I've ever had in Warhammer. I've read in the lore that the prince is considered to be somewhat of a douche. At some point, he attempts to blackmail his way into becoming the Phoenix King, and after that fails, he ends up joining Malekith, the leader of the Dark Elves. Imrik was a great free chunk of content, but we need to talk about the DLC policy. There are problems. It's not as bad as you think. Most of these truly are optional. When recording footage for this video, I was surprised to discover that I own almost all downloadable content for Warhammer 1. I wasn't even trying to acquire it all. Some of these DLCs are free, others I got on sale, and some of them were gifts from a friend. A good number of the DLCs are actually mini expansions. A lot of work goes into them. New mechanics, new legendary lords, voice acting, new visual assets and animations. These feel significantly more substantial than the DLCs for Paradox games. And there is no reason to buy an expansion for a faction you don't play or a fantasy you don't enjoy. I don't like the fantasy of being a stupid oversized rat, so I don't buy their content, but I guess other people do, and that's fine.
Skaven would fall to true chaos.
The developers are regularly accused of having a Skaven bias. However, some of the DLCs are more important than they have a right to be. For example, you can play dwarves without buying anything. Well, anything except Warhammer 1. This is a stock Warhammer 1 faction. But in that case, you won't get all the regiments of renown for any of the free dwarf heroes. So if you want elite units, you have to pay. A very important feature is paywalled. A common complaint is that they make you purchase the blood effects separately, but you know what? I've never actually bought that one. Some consider these effects to be essential in a Total War game, but I think they just look stupid. They remind me of Dragon Age 1, and that's not a compliment. Sophisticated strategy games, like the ones we love, always require patches, iterations, mechanical and content expansions in order to become the best versions of themselves. On release day, many of these games come out playable, and some can even be described as fun, but they are never complete. This is the nature of the medium. The process of iteration can go on for years. I used to resent the Total War series for being an inferior RTS married to an inferior 4X, trying to do two things at the same time and failing at both. And this might have been true for the older titles, but with Warhammer 2 things began to change. Both the real-time strategy and the 4X parts are evolving. The best way to facilitate post-release support is by making it profitable. Paradox and Creative Assembly are both famous or infamous for their DLC policy. The complete experience will cost you several times the price of the base game. And yet, this approach guarantees years of support, fixes, iterations, bringing the game closer to perfection with each content update. So, what is the best thing for us as consumers to do? Never said I have all the answers. I'm not sure what the best course of action actually is. Please be gentle when you fuck us, Creative Assembly. The issue is made even more complicated by the fact that the Total War series is a survivor. There are more real-time strategy games on the market now than just a few years ago, but RTS remains a niche genre. If you like these, you don't have many choices. Anyway, Total War Warhammer 2 is really good. The third game will have its own version of the Mortal Empires campaign, expanding the world even further. Content from all three Warhammer titles merged into one. Personally, I'm hoping to see the inclusion of a playable Kislev faction. It seems almost inevitable that we'll get Kislev eventually. Tsar Boris Bokha riding into battle on a bear. Fuck yes. Earlier I mentioned that in the lore, Archaon succeeds in ending the Warhammer world. It happens right here, in Middenheim. The third warp gate was found beneath the city.
We march at daybreak.
And all the stories are concluded.
Very vivid description of heads flying, limbs cut off, and the chaos, the dust, the panic, the shouting, the screaming of what happens when you have several thousand men who know they're going to die and there's no way out.
The Beastmen hordes manage to overrun Ethel-Loren, the Elven Forest. The shock troops of Chaos, they participate in the battles against the Empire as cannon fodder, just like in our campaign. Eventually they get annihilated by the Imperials. Malagor, the Dark Omen, gets killed by the new Supreme Patriarch. Vampirism spreads to Britannia, becoming a popular pastime among the decadent nobles. But they do manage to get their shit together in the end. The Space Marines, aided by undead knights, make the final last stand against the forces of Chaos. Dark Elves, High Elves, and Wood Elves unite into a single nation. Witch King Malekith becomes their leader. The three factions of elves are now forbidden from fighting one another. They also exterminate the Beastmen, but that is just routine. The Lizardmen discover that they are in possession of ancient devices called Exodus engines. This is the last resort kind of thing. As the hordes of Skaven overwhelm them, the lizards activate Exodus engines that turn out to be spaceships. So the dinos flee to the stars, like they did in real life. Orcs gather into a massive army, kill a bunch of rats, then kill a bunch of chaos dwarves, almost all of them in fact. Then they invade the Warhammer China, destroying it almost completely. Then they sail to Warhammer Japan and wreak havoc there as well. Warhammer Japan is called Nippon. Eventually the orcs end up in Middenheim, where they battle the forces of chaos. Prior to this, Skarsnik's pet Squig dies and he is heartbroken. The Horned Rat makes his move. The Skaven clans unite and invade the world as an unstoppable force. The rats ally themselves with Archaon with an intention to betray him later, but that's okay. Archaon was only using them as cannon fodder because at that point he ran out of beastmen. When the world ends, the Horned Rat moves Skavenblight into his warp realm and becomes a true chaos god, on par with Khorne or Tzeentch. That's quite a career. The rat certainly did better than Hashut, the patron demon of chaos dwarves, who got owned by the avatars of Gork and Mork, the orc gods. After a series of events, Sigvald ended up battling Krell, a powerful undead champion. Krell was winning. He cut Sigvald's pretty face and broke his rapier. The Scion of Slaanesh had a portrait of Dorian Gray kind of moment. He saw his mutilated, hideous face in a reflection and went berserk, beating the shit out of Krell and killing him with his bare fists. Sigvald was no longer a pretty boy. This was when his old buddy Throg the Troll King found him. Taking advantage of the moment of weakness, Throg bashed Sigvald's skull and pissed on his corpse. And that was the end for the patron of the arts. Until he comes back as a demon prince in the reboot. Bam! Fuck you, Throg. The lands of men, Kislev, most of the Empire and Britannia are in ruins. The combined forces of order actually managed to retake Middenheim. Karl Franz ascends, becoming Sigmar himself. In the final confrontation, he battles Archaon, and they are both consumed by the warp as the world ends.
Big disadvantage that they were surrounded and they were hot.